Marcus Hill woke up before the sun that morning, rubbing his eyes as the alarm buzzed softly beside his bed. He had an important business meeting in Chicago, one that could change the direction of his career. The presentation he had prepared for weeks could decide whether his company won a $1 million contract. He showered quickly, dressed in a neat blue suit, and looked at himself in the mirror. He looked confident, calm, and ready. He was proud of how far he had come. Growing up in a small neighborhood in Atlanta, he had dreamed of flying one day, not just in a plane, but in life rising higher than people expected him to. He checked his watch, grabbed his laptop bag, and called for a ride to the airport. The driver, a friendly man with a warm smile, asked where he was headed. Marcus replied, "Chicago," and the driver nodded, saying, "Big city, big dreams, huh?" Marcus laughed softly, unaware of how true those words would become. The airport was already awake, full of rushing travelers, rolling suitcases, and the scent of coffee in the air. Marcus walked through the crowd, scanning the flight board until he found it. Eagle Jet Flight 227 to Chicago. Departing at 8:10 a.m. first class, seat 2A, he smiled, remembering how hard he had worked to reach a point where he could afford a first-class ticket. At the check-in counter, the attendant looked at his ticket and smiled politely. "Good morning, Mr. Hill," she said. "Everything looks perfect. Have a great flight." Marcus thanked her and moved through security. He always tried to be polite, no matter how small the moment. After passing through the metal detector and collecting his things, he stopped to buy a cup of coffee. He liked his coffee strong and simple. The warmth in his hands felt comforting as he walked toward the gate. He arrived just as they began boarding first-class passengers. Marcus handed his ticket to the flight attendant at the gate. She scanned it, smiled, and said, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Hill." He nodded with a kind smile and stepped inside the plane. The scent of clean air mixed with fabric and soft lighting made the cabin feel calm. He found his seat. 2A. Right by the window, the leather was smooth, and the space felt wide and peaceful. He placed his bag under the seat and stretched a little, looking outside at the busy runway. The morning sun was rising gently, casting a golden light over the parked airplanes as he settled in. Marcus opened his laptop to review his slides one last time. The numbers, the charts, and the words on the screen reminded him of all the late nights he had worked. Sometimes he remembered his mother saying, "If you keep your head high and your heart clean, the world will have to see you." He smiled quietly, hearing her voice in his mind. The other first-class passengers slowly began to fill the seats. A man in a gray suit sat in 2B. A woman in a business dress opened a magazine across the aisle. Marcus nodded politely at them and returned to his laptop. He could hear the muffled sounds of boarding in the back, families finding seats, flight attendants guiding people, luggage being lifted overhead. One of the flight attendants, a young woman with blonde hair tied neatly, walked through first class, checking bags and offering smiles. Marcus looked up and smiled back. She gave a short nod, but her expression was oddly tight. She paused for a second near his seat, glanced at his ticket on the screen, then continued walking. Marcus didn't think much of it. He assumed she was just doing her job. He took a sip of coffee and put in his headphones. Letting soft music play, he felt good, calm, focused, ready for the day. A few minutes later, another flight attendant, older and wearing a sharp expression, came through. She stopped for a moment, looked at Marcus, then at her tablet, then back at him. He gave a polite nod, but she didn't return it. Instead, she whispered something to her co-worker and pointed subtly in his direction. Marcus noticed this small exchange but tried to brush it off. He didn't want to start his day with suspicion or negativity. Maybe they were just sorting passenger details, he told himself. He adjusted his tie, straightened his jacket, and stared out the window again, watching as the ground crew moved equipment around. The engines began to hum softly as the plane prepared for takeoff. Passengers buckled their seatbelts. The captain's voice came over the intercom, and the cabin lights dimmed slightly. Marcus took a deep breath and closed his laptop. He whispered to himself, "Just one meeting, do your best, and fly home proud." At that moment, he didn't know that this ordinary morning flight would soon become the story of his life. In just a few minutes, everything would change, not because of his work, but because of something far beyond his control. But for now, he was just a man on a plane, sitting in his seat, sipping his coffee, ready for a new day, unaware that every passenger around him, every camera, and every pair of eyes would soon witness something that would echo far beyond that aircraft. Marcus Hill thought he was flying to Chicago for a business deal, but fate had already written a different flight plan for him, one that would make headlines, change lives, and bring down an entire airline. Marcus leaned back in his seat, still feeling proud of himself. He had made it to first class, a quiet space filled with polite smiles, the soft hum of the engines, and the smell of brewed coffee around him. Passengers scrolled through their phones, checked emails, or chatted in calm voices. It was supposed to be a peaceful morning, but as the minutes passed, Marcus began to feel something strange. It wasn't loud or obvious, just a faint shift in the air, a kind of tension that crawled under the surface. 2 flight attendants were whispering near the galley, glancing toward him from time to time. Their expressions weren't friendly curiosity. They looked uncertain, almost nervous. Marcus told himself not to think too much. He had experienced little moments like this before. A stare that lasted too long, a tone that felt colder than it should. Being a black man in professional spaces had taught him to read those quiet signals, but also to stay calm, so he focused on his laptop. Scrolling through his slides again, the first-class cabin wasn't big, maybe 12 seats in total. The woman sitting across the aisle wore expensive perfume and diamond earrings. She looked at Marcus for a second, then quickly looked away. The man beside him adjusted his jacket. Avoiding eye contact, Marcus smiled politely, trying to ease the stiffness in the air, but nobody smiled back. He took a slow breath, reminding himself that he belonged there. He had worked hard, paid for that ticket, and earned his place. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible was circling around him. After a few minutes, one of the flight attendants, the younger one, approached with a forced smile. "Sir, would you like a drink before takeoff?" she asked. Her voice sounded polite, but her eyes didn't match. Marcus smiled kindly. "Just water, thank you," he said. She nodded, but before she turned away, she glanced quickly at his ticket again, as if checking for something. When she returned with his glass of water, Marcus noticed her whisper something to her coworker again. The older attendant frowned, looked at him, then at the manifest on her tablet. Marcus could almost feel their eyes on him as he lifted the glass to take a sip. His hand stayed steady, but inside a quiet unease began to grow. He tried to distract himself by watching the ground crew outside the window. Men in bright jackets loaded luggage and checked the wheels. The morning light was brighter now, painting the runway gold. Marcus loved that view. It usually reminded him of new beginnings, but today something about it felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. The captain's voice echoed softly through the cabin. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be taking off shortly." Passengers buckled up. Flight attendants moved briskly. Marcus closed his laptop and placed it carefully in his bag. He leaned back and smiled faintly, telling himself everything was fine. Then he heard it. A soft murmur from the 2 attendants behind the curtain. "That's the one, seat 2, one of them whispered. Marcus didn't catch the rest, but the words hit his chest like a weight. He wasn't sure what they meant, but his instincts told him it wasn't good. He turned slightly, pretending to adjust his jacket, just enough to see them out of the corner of his eye. The older attendant was tapping on her tablet again, shaking her head. The younger one bit her lip, her eyes darting nervously toward him. Marcus's heart began to beat faster, not in fear but in confusion. He replayed every step of the morning in his mind. Had he done something wrong? Had there been a problem with his ticket? No, he had confirmed everything twice, he was certain, completely certain. The engines roared softly as the plane prepared to taxi. A few passengers were laughing in the rows behind. One man was telling a joke, unaware of the quiet drama unfolding just a few seats ahead. Marcus straightened his tie again, feeling a flicker of discomfort in his chest. He tried to remind himself that appearances could be deceiving. Maybe they were discussing something unrelated. Maybe this was all in his head, but deep down, a small voice whispered, "No, you've seen this before." It was the same voice that had warned him years ago when a security guard followed him in a store, or when a client spoke over him in a meeting despite his expertise. It was the voice of experience. As the plane began to move, the older attendant suddenly walked down the aisle again, this time stopping beside his seat. Her expression was polite but cold. She glanced at his boarding pass tucked in the seat pocket, then looked at him directly. "Excuse me, sir. Could I see your ticket again?" "Please," she asked. Marcus blinked, surprised. "Of course," he said calmly, pulling it out and handing it to her. She studied it for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Thank you," she said. Before walking away without another word, he sat back slowly, confusion twisting into unease. The man beside him looked away awkwardly, pretending to focus on his newspaper. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thicker. Heavier. Marcus looked out the window again, his reflection faint against the glass for the first time. He didn't see a confident businessman. He saw a man being silently questioned for simply existing where some people didn't expect him to be. The engines grew louder, the plane ready to lift. But inside Marcus's chest, another kind of flight had already begun, one powered by nerves, uncertainty, and the quiet knowledge that something was about to happen, something unfair. He didn't know it yet, but those uneasy stares, those whispers, and that single request for his ticket would soon lead to a moment that would shake the entire airline. The first-class cabin was calm on the outside, but underneath history was already stirring its wings, ready to take off in a direction no one could predict. Marcus sat quietly in his seat, pretending to scroll through his phone, but his mind was no longer on his presentation. The strange tension that had started with a few glances had now grown into a heavy silence, a silence that seemed to hum louder than the engines. The younger flight attendant passed by again, her hand slightly shaking as she adjusted a tray. She didn't meet his eyes this time. The plane had not yet taken off. The captain's voice announced a short delay. "We'll be waiting a few minutes for clearance," he said. Passengers sighed, some groaned, a few went back to their phones. But Marcus's focus was elsewhere. He noticed the two attendants whispering again, this time joined by a third, a man in a supervisor's uniform. The supervisor glanced toward Marcus, then nodded slowly. Marcus felt the hairs on his neck rise. He didn't know why, but he could feel that whatever was about to happen, it wasn't about a simple mistake. A few minutes later, the older flight attendant approached him again. Her smile looked practiced, but her tone carried a chill. "Sir," she began, "I'm afraid there seems to be an issue with your seat. Could I please see your boarding pass one more time?" Marcus handed it over politely. "Of course," he said. She looked at it briefly, then gave a small, tight nod. "Thank you," she murmured, and walked back toward the galley again. He could see her showing the ticket to the supervisor, who frowned and tapped on his tablet. Passengers nearby began to notice something was off. A few exchanged glances, whispering to each other. Marcus shifted in his seat, trying to remain composed. Years of experience had taught him to stay calm, to let logic lead, not emotion, but his chest tightened anyway. Moments later, the supervisor approached. "Sir," he said in a professional voice, "there appears to be a mix-up in our system. The seat might not be correctly assigned." Marcus blinked. Confused, "That can't be right," he replied. "I booked this first-class ticket last week. Here's the confirmation email." He opened his phone and showed it, clear as day, his name, his seat number, and the payment receipt. The supervisor barely glanced at the screen before saying, "I understand, sir, but our records are showing that this seat isn't available to you." His tone was flat, rehearsed like someone reading from a script. Marcus stayed calm. "I think there's a mistake," he said softly. "Could you double-check I paid for this seat?" The man's expression hardened. "Sir, we need you to move to economy so we can resolve this. You're delaying the flight." Marcus felt his pulse quicken, but his voice stayed even. "I'm not delaying anything," he said. "I've done nothing wrong. I have my ticket right here." The cabin had gone quiet now. People were watching. The woman across the aisle lowered her magazine. The man beside Marcus looked down awkwardly. Pretending not to hear, the tension spread like wildfire. The younger flight attendant appeared again. Her face pale, she whispered something to the supervisor, who shook his head. "Sir, please," he said louder this time. "We're asking you to move. We don't want this to become a bigger issue." Marcus looked around. His heart pounding, he could feel every eye on him. He tried to keep his dignity. "I'm not causing a problem," he said, his voice firm but respectful. "I just want to sit in the seat I paid for. That's all." The supervisor's lips tightened. "Sir, if you refuse to comply, we'll have to call security." Those words dropped like ice into Marcus's stomach. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked down at his boarding pass again, at his name printed clearly in bold letters. Marcus Hill, first class, seat 2A. Everything was correct. And yet somehow he was the one being treated like a trespasser. A passenger 2 rows back took out their phone and started recording. Another whispered, "That's not right." He didn't do anything, but nobody spoke loudly enough to stop what was happening. Marcus exhaled slowly, fighting the rising heat of humiliation. He could feel it in his throat, burning behind his calm expression. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "I have proof. Please look at it." But the supervisor was already shaking his head. "Sir, we need to keep order on the plane. You'll have to step off for clarification." The younger attendant looked away, tears almost forming in her eyes. The older one stood beside her with folded arms, confident and cold. Marcus realized then they had already made up their minds before even speaking to him. He sat still for a moment, every muscle frozen between anger and disbelief. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Fine," he said in a low voice. "If that's what it takes for you to see I'm not wrong, I'll go." As he stood, the cabin seemed to shrink around him. The aisle felt longer than it should have. Every step carried the weight of eyes watching, judging, recording. The hum of the engines mixed with the quiet clicking of phone cameras. When he reached the door, the younger attendant whispered, "I'm sorry," almost too softly to hear. Marcus didn't respond. He stepped out of the plane, the door closing behind him with a final metallic click. Inside the cabin, people murmured, a few shaking their heads, one or two saying, "That was unfair," but no one had done anything to stop it. In the gate area, Marcus stood still, ticket still in his hand. His chest rose and fell slowly. He looked at the printed words again, his name, his seat, everything in perfect order, he whispered to himself. They didn't even look. At that moment, a man sitting nearby approached. "Hey, I recorded what happened," he said. "That wasn't right." "People need to see this," Marcus blinked. "Surprised you recorded it?" he asked. The man nodded. "Yeah, and you're not the only one. Others got it too." Marcus felt a small spark inside him. Not of anger, but of something deeper, truth. He didn't know it yet, but those recordings would soon travel across the world, turning his quiet humiliation into a storm that would shake the entire airline industry. Marcus stood outside the aircraft door, his hands trembling slightly. The noise of the airport filled his ears. The rolling suitcases, the murmurs, the faraway announcements calling passengers to other gates. But inside him there was only silence, a deep, hollow silence that came after being made to feel small. He had been removed from the plane as if he were dangerous. Yet he hadn't raised his voice, hadn't broken any rule. He had only asked to sit in the seat he had paid for, and somehow that was enough to make him an enemy. The gate agent looked startled when she saw the supervisor bring Marcus back. "What happened?" she asked, glancing between them. The supervisor gave a cold shrug. "Ticket issue," he said quickly. "We'll reassign him once we confirm his booking." Marcus wanted to speak, to defend himself, but his voice caught in his throat. He felt every stare from the nearby passengers, some curious, others judgmental. It wasn't just about being asked to leave. It was about being treated as if his presence didn't belong. He walked a few steps away, found an empty chair near the window and sat down. His reflection in the glass looked calm, but his heart was racing. He stared at the boarding pass again. The black print bold and clear, seat 2A. His name right there, Marcus Hill. Nothing about it was wrong, except the way people had decided to see him. As he sat there trying to steady his breathing, a woman approached. She had short brown hair and a phone in her hand. "Sir," she said softly, "I'm sorry for what just happened. I recorded it. The way they treated you wasn't right." Marcus blinked. Surprised. "You recorded it?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Yes, and others did too. I'm a journalist, actually. My name's Clara Jennings. I'm not sure who you are, but this story and it matters." Marcus hesitated, still overwhelmed. "I'm just a passenger," he said. "I wasn't trying to make a scene." Clara nodded gently. "I know, that's exactly why people need to see it." Before he could say more, the boarding door reopened and 2 airport security officers appeared. Their expressions were blank. "Mr. Hill," one said, "we've been told there was a disturbance on the plane. Can you come with us for a moment?" Passengers nearby turned their heads, phones rising like little glowing eyes, recording, whispering. Marcus stood slowly. "There was no disturbance," he said quietly. "I was sitting in my assigned seat. They made me leave." But the officers didn't respond. They simply gestured toward the corridor. Marcus followed, walking past rows of watching faces. He could hear someone whisper, "That's him." And another voice say, "What did he do?" That question. What did he do? cut deeper than the stairs. Because the truth was simple. He hadn't done anything, yet to everyone watching it looked like he had. They took him to a small waiting area near customer service. The supervisor followed, his expression a mix of nerves and control. "Sir," he began, "we're still looking into the seating issue. It appears there was an internal mix-up." Marcus stared at him, his voice calm but firm. "A mix-up?" he repeated. "You dragged me off a plane in front of everyone for a mix-up." The supervisor cleared his throat. "We apologize for the inconvenience," he said, using the word inconvenience like it could erase the humiliation that still burned inside Marcus's chest. Clara appeared again from the corner, still recording. "Do you have any comment?" she asked the supervisor. "Because this man's ticket clearly says first class, and yet he was removed." The supervisor froze, his corporate tone slipping. "Ma'am, please stop filming," he said, but it was too late. Other passengers had already posted their videos online. Within minutes, one clip showed Marcus standing quietly while being told to leave. Another showed him stepping off the plane with his bag, silent, proud, and heartbroken. In the background of one video, a passenger's voice could be heard saying, "That's not right, he didn't do anything wrong." Another voice answered, "Yeah, but you know how it is." That simple phrase, "You know how it is," carried centuries of weight. By the time Marcus sat back down in the terminal, trying to process what had just happened, his phone buzzed. At first, he ignored it, but then the notifications began to pour in. Messages from friends, colleagues, even strangers. "Marcus, are you okay?" one read. "You're trending online," said another. He opened Twitter and froze. His face was everywhere, in shaky phone videos, in reposted screenshots, in headlines forming minute by minute. The hashtags had already begun. Flying while black. Justice for Marcus. Thousands of people were watching, sharing, and demanding answers. Marcus rubbed his temples, feeling dizzy. He hadn't asked for any of this. He just wanted to get to Chicago, to do his job. Yet somehow, he had become a symbol in a story much bigger than himself. Across the airport, people whispered as he passed. Some offered sympathetic smiles. Others avoided eye contact. One child tugged at his mother's hand and asked, "Mom, why did they take that man off the plane?" And the mother had no answer. Marcus sat again, his coffee now cold, his spirit heavy but unbroken. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just sat in quiet dignity. The humiliation had cut deep, but something inside him refused to bend. As the sun climbed higher outside the glass windows, casting long shadows across the terminal floor, Marcus looked out at the planes lifting off the runway, one after another. He whispered to himself, "Someday, I'll rise too." He didn't know it yet. But the videos spreading online would soon ignite outrage across the country. Reporters would call, lawyers would get involved, and before long, the same airline that had humiliated him in public would face a truth it could no longer ignore. For now, though, he was just a man in an airport chair, holding his ticket, waiting for justice to catch its flight. Marcus sat in the airport terminal, his mind racing but his body still. The world outside those glass windows seemed ordinary. People boarding flights, announcements echoing softly, coffee cups clinking on tables. But inside Marcus, a storm had begun. He stared at his phone, at the videos now spreading like wildfire. He hadn't planned for any of this. He didn't even know half the people filming him. Yet their recordings were now giving his story a voice, one louder than he could have ever imagined. The first video showed him calmly showing his ticket. Another captured the moment the flight crew asked him to leave. Each clip was short, but together, they told a powerful truth. A truth that needed no fancy words. Just the image of a man being treated unfairly for no reason. Clara Jennings, the journalist who had spoken to him earlier, sat beside him now, typing rapidly on her laptop. "It's everywhere," she said softly. "Your story's already been shared thousands of times." Marcus looked at her, still dazed. "Why?" he asked. "Why would anyone care about a stranger on a plane?" Clara stopped typing and looked up. Because people are tired of this happening, she said. Tired of pretending not to see it. Marcus leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. He wasn't sure what to feel. Anger, sadness, disbelief. Maybe all of them at once. He had always tried to believe in fairness, in reason, in calm conversation. But now he realized that sometimes it takes witnesses for truth to survive. At another gate nearby, 2 young passengers who had been on the same flight were also posting their own clips. "This man did nothing wrong," one of them said into the camera. "They pulled him off like he didn't belong, even though he was polite the whole time." Their voices joined a growing chorus online, strangers uniting through screens and empathy. By afternoon, the videos had been shared by local news pages, civil rights groups, and celebrities. Each share carried the same caption: "Justice for Marcus." Marcus scrolled through the comments, his heart tightening as he read words from people he'd never met. "This could have been my dad," one person wrote. "My brother," said another. "We see you, Marcus," said hundreds more. Meanwhile, at EagleJet headquarters, the situation was spiraling out of control. A PR officer stared at the trending list, panic in her voice. "We need a statement," she said. "Now." The executives quickly released one. "We regret a misunderstanding involving one of our passengers." It read, "We are investigating the incident, but people weren't fooled. They had seen the videos, seen Marcus's calmness and the crew's coldness. The word misunderstanding only made them angrier. It sounded like the company was trying to erase what everyone had witnessed with their own eyes." Back at the airport, Marcus sat quietly as journalists began to arrive. Some asked for interviews. Others shouted questions. "Do you plan to sue? What did they say to you? How do you feel?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at Clara, who gave him a small nod, encouraging but gentle. Finally, Marcus spoke in a low, steady voice. "I just wanted to go to work," he said. "I just wanted to sit in my seat." Those words, simple and honest, hit harder than any angry speech could. Within hours, that one quote was printed across headlines. "I just wanted to sit in my seat." As the day went on, something remarkable began to happen. Other passengers who had once stayed silent started to come forward. One woman emailed a local news station saying she had seen similar treatment before on the same airline. A former employee anonymously shared messages describing internal bias training that was never taken seriously. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to form. Marcus's story had opened a door that many had kept closed for years. And now, with thousands watching, the truth couldn't be pushed back inside. Marcus received hundreds of messages that night. From people of every background, a retired pilot wrote, "I've seen this kind of thing happen. You handled it with more grace than most," a teacher from Chicago sent. "Your calm gave others courage to speak." For the first time that day, Marcus smiled faintly. He wasn't smiling because he felt happy. He smiled because he realized he wasn't alone anymore. His humiliation had become a mirror, reflecting something much bigger than him. Clara uploaded an article that night, titled "The Man They Tried to Move: How One Passenger's Dignity Sparked a Movement." It spread fast. People weren't just watching now. They were demanding answers. EagleJet tried to control the damage, releasing a second statement calling the incident unfortunate and promising an internal review. But the internet wasn't forgiving. Comment after comment read, "Unfortunate isn't enough. Fire the crew. Do better." By midnight, the story had reached international news. Marcus's phone buzzed nonstop. Reporters, lawyers, activists. Everyone wanted to speak to him. But he stayed quiet, choosing to let the truth speak for itself. In his hotel room that night, Marcus sat by the window, watching planes take off under the silver light of the moon. Each one rising into the dark sky reminded him of hope, fragile, but unbreakable. He whispered softly, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, but to every person who had chosen to see, to care, to speak. The world can be cruel, he thought, but it can also be kind. Sometimes the smallest act, pressing record on a phone, sharing a video telling the truth, can shift everything. As the night deepened, Marcus finally closed his eyes. The videos, the chaos, the noise. It all faded for a moment. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he also knew something had changed forever. He was no longer just a man pulled off a plane. He had become the reason others would never stay silent again. The power of witnesses had turned one man's quiet pain into a collective roar, and somewhere out there, even as he slept, the world was still watching, still sharing, still demanding justice, one view at a time. The next morning, Marcus woke up to a flood of notifications. His phone buzzed nonstop, lighting up with hundreds of messages, emails, and missed calls. Overnight, his name had gone from being unknown to trending on every major news site. His story was no longer just a viral video. It had become a movement. He rubbed his eyes, sitting at the edge of the hotel bed. He had barely slept. The memory of being pulled off the plane still replayed in his mind like a scene stuck on repeat. But now there was something new in the air. Power. The power of truth. The power of millions who had seen what really happened, across town. Inside the tall glass headquarters of EagleJet Airlines, the mood was very different. The boardroom was filled with tension. Executives sat around a long table, faces pale, voices sharp. A giant screen on the wall displayed the headline everyone feared. Passenger pulled from first class sparks national outrage. The CEO, a man named Richard Cole, slammed his palm on the table. How did this happen, he barked, and why was he removed? Who approved that? No one answered. The head of customer service spoke softly. Sir, the crew claimed it was a seating issue. Richard glared at her. A seating issue that's now costing us millions in stock value, he said bitterly. The PR director spoke next, trying to sound calm. We've already released an apology, sir, calling it a misunderstanding. The CEO turned sharply. A misunderstanding, he repeated. Have you seen the videos? There was no misunderstanding. It was discrimination. Plain and simple. Outside the boardroom, the company's public relations team was drowning in chaos. Reporters were calling nonstop, hashtags were exploding, and thousands of customers were demanding refunds. Some even posted videos of themselves cutting up their EagleJet credit cards, shouting, "We don't fly hate." By noon, the company released another statement, this time more carefully worded. We are deeply sorry for the incident involving Mr. Marcus Hill, it read. We have suspended the flight crew pending an investigation. But it was too late. The public wasn't buying it. Comments flooded every post. You're only sorry because you got caught, one said. How many others have you treated like this, wrote another. The anger online was no longer just about Marcus. It was about every quiet injustice that had been ignored before. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in a hotel lobby surrounded by reporters, microphones in his face, flashing cameras all around. He didn't shout or demand revenge, he simply spoke the truth. I didn't want trouble, he said calmly. I wanted respect. I paid for a seat. Not a lesson in prejudice. His words spread across every channel. Powerful in their honesty, Clara Jennings, the journalist who had helped share his story, sat beside him typing another article. She looked up and said, They're losing control, Marcus. People are digging into their history and it doesn't look good. Within days, former employees of EagleJet began speaking out, one after another. They shared their own experiences, stories of passengers profiled, complaints ignored, and managers brushing everything under the rug. One ex-pilot wrote online, They always said image mattered more than integrity. Soon regulators took notice. The Department of Transportation and the Civil Aviation Authority both announced they were opening official investigations into EagleJet's practices. The pressure grew heavier by the hour. Inside the company, panic spread like wildfire. Meetings ran late into the night, lawyers argued. PR teams begged for calm. We can fix this, one executive insisted. We just need to settle privately. But the CEO knew it was too late. You can't settle with the internet, he muttered. Once people see the truth, you can't hide it. Marcus watched everything unfold from a distance. He never asked for fame or revenge. But part of him hoped that maybe, just maybe, this would mean something. Maybe it would change how people were treated. One afternoon, he received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Mr. Hill, a polite voice said, This is Richard Cole, CEO of EagleJet Airlines. I wanted to personally apologize. Marcus stayed silent for a moment, then said quietly, You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry people saw it. There was a long pause. And then the line went dead. The news channels replayed that quote over and over. "You're not sorry people saw it." It became another symbol of the truth behind corporate apologies. Words spoken for cameras, not for change. By the end of the week, EagleJet's stock had dropped by 27%. Sponsors pulled their partnerships. Travel influencers announced boycotts, and major airports began reviewing contracts with the airline. It was as if the world had decided to teach the company a lesson that no PR team could rewrite. Clara called Marcus that evening. "You did it," she said softly. "You made them listen." Marcus shook his head. "No," he said, "we did it. All the people who recorded, who shared, who refused to look away." That night, the CEO appeared on live television for an emergency press conference. His face was tight, his voice trembling slightly as he said, "We take full responsibility for the incident involving Mr. Hill." But even as he spoke, viewers noticed the insincerity, the stiffness in his tone. The world could tell, and this was not a confession. It was damage control online. Millions of comments poured in again. "Apologize with action, not words," someone wrote. "Fire the leadership," said another. Marcus watched quietly from his hotel room. The man who had once felt powerless now watched a billion-dollar company bend under the weight of the truth. And yet there was no satisfaction in his eyes. Only reflection. He whispered to himself, "All I wanted was a seat," but deep down, he knew it was never just about the seat. It was about being seen, about dignity, about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. The world was watching EagleJet crumble, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt something different, not anger, not pride, but hope, because for once, the system was shaking and the truth was winning. The days that followed felt unreal for Marcus. Each sunrise brought another wave of headlines, another news anchor saying his name, another stranger online calling him brave. He hadn't meant to become a symbol. He had only wanted fairness, but sometimes, the smallest act of standing your ground can shake mountains. At EagleJet headquarters, the walls that once echoed with pride now carried whispers of fear. The airline that had ruled the skies for decades was beginning to crumble, and everyone inside could feel it. Investigators walked through the glass doors with thick folders and quiet faces. The company's secrets were no longer safe behind smiles and slogans. Emails, reports, and complaints began to surface. Some were years old, hidden deep in digital drawers. They told stories of ignored discrimination claims, unfair firings, and silent settlements for years. EagleJet had buried its problems under layers of paperwork and polite excuses. But now everything was coming out, line by line, file by file, truth by truth. The public watched in disbelief. News channels played clips of former employees speaking openly, a pilot said on camera. "We were told to avoid making certain passengers uncomfortable. But nobody cared when passengers made us uncomfortable," a flight attendant admitted. "We complained about bias training being a joke." But management laughed. The world was finally seeing what had been hidden behind the airline's polished wings. Meanwhile, Marcus tried to stay out of the spotlight. He turned down interviews and refused sponsorships. He didn't want to profit from pain, he just wanted justice. But every time he walked outside, people stopped him, shook his hand, and thanked him. "You made them listen," one woman told him in the grocery store. "You gave us courage," said another. The government investigation intensified. Regulators uncovered a pattern of racial bias in customer service records. One report showed that black passengers were 3 times more likely to be reseated than others. Another revealed internal messages between supervisors joking about passenger appearances. When these findings hit the media, EagleJet's reputation collapsed overnight. Stock prices fell like raindrops in a storm. Investors panicked, partners pulled out, and within a week, flights began getting canceled one after another. Inside the company, chaos ruled. Employees whispered in break rooms. "Are we going to lose our jobs?" one asked. "They say the feds might shut us down," another replied. The CEO, Richard Cole, stood in his office staring out at the city skyline. The sun was setting, its reflection flickering across his desk. He had built his career on that airline, spent 30 years climbing its ladder, and now it was falling apart because of one moment of truth. One man, one injustice too many. He turned to his PR director. "Can we survive this?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her phone and read aloud, "Sir, it's trending again. To ground EagleJet." Richard closed his eyes, the weight of defeat sinking deep into his chest. The next morning, the government made it official. The Department of Transportation announced that EagleJet's operating license was suspended indefinitely, pending further investigation into systemic racial misconduct and safety violations. The news hit the world like a thunderclap. TV anchors spoke in stunned tones. EagleJet, once one of the nation's top airlines, is grounded. The footage of Marcus being escorted off the plane played beside clips of empty ticket counters and closed gates. It felt symbolic. Justice landing at last at airports across the country. EagleJet planes sat motionless on the tarmac, their blue and silver tails gleaming in the sun. Pilots stood outside their grounded aircraft, shaking their heads in disbelief. Employees cried, passengers demanded refunds, and travel agencies scrambled to reroute flights. In the middle of it all, Marcus watched the news quietly from his living room. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't celebrating. He just sat there in silence, the sound of justice echoing louder than any applause could. Clara called him that night, her voice trembling with emotion. "They shut it down, Marcus," she said. "You did it," he sighed softly. "No, Clara," he said. "We all did it. Every person who spoke, every person who filmed, every person who refused to stay quiet. On social media, millions of people shared their thoughts. History has been made," one post read. "For once, accountability took flight," another said. The world had watched a man stripped of dignity in public, and now, they were watching the system that allowed it finally pay the price. A week later, the CEO resigned. His letter was short, full of regret, but the damage was irreversible. Journalists called it the fastest corporate collapse in airline history, but to Marcus, it wasn't about collapse, and it was about awakening. He knew that nothing could undo the pain of that day, but he also knew something greater had come from it. People were talking, companies were changing their policies, and more passengers were speaking up when they saw unfairness. One evening, Marcus took a quiet walk by the airport fence. Watching other planes take off, he could still see EagleJet's grounded aircraft parked in the distance. "Lifeless and silent," he whispered. "Sometimes you have to fall to learn how to fly right." The wind carried his words away, blending with the distant roar of engines belonging to other airlines. Airlines that now had to think twice before repeating EagleJet's mistakes. In that moment, Marcus realized something powerful. He hadn't destroyed an airline. He had forced an entire industry to look in the mirror, to face the truth it had ignored for too long. The world had witnessed a fall. Yes, but not just of a company. It was the fall of arrogance, of prejudice, of silence, and from that fall, something new was rising, awareness, courage, and change. For Marcus Hill, that was enough. The news of EagleJet's shutdown echoed around the world. For days, television screens replayed the same image. Marcus Hill, walking calmly off a plane, holding nothing but his dignity. The man who had been forced out of his seat had unknowingly become the man who helped change the sky itself. Yet as the world argued, cheered, and analyzed, Marcus stayed quiet. He avoided interviews, declined sponsorships, and ignored offers from lawyers promising big settlements. He didn't want fame or fortune. He wanted peace. For a while, that peace was hard to find. Reporters camped outside his home. Neighbors whispered. Some treated him like a hero, others like a headline. But Marcus knew that real change didn't come from noise. It came from persistence, from people who kept going even after the cameras stopped rolling. He went back to his job in Atlanta a few months later. Walking into the same office where he had worked before the storm, his coworkers greeted him with applause. Someone had taped a newspaper headline to his desk that read, "The passenger who grounded a giant." Marcus smiled politely, but his eyes carried a quiet sadness. In meetings, he noticed something different. People listened when he spoke. Colleagues who once overlooked him now sought his opinion. The respect he had always earned was finally being given freely. And yet, part of him wished it hadn't taken a public humiliation for people to see his worth. At night, he sometimes sat by his window, looking at the city lights blinking like stars. He would think about that day, the coldness of the flight attendants' voices, the tightness in his chest, the silence of the passengers who watched, and then he would think about what came after. The voices that finally spoke, the strangers who cared, the justice that arrived, even if late months turned into a year, and Marcus began to receive invitations to speak at events, universities, diversity panels, and civil rights organizations wanted him to share his story. At first he refused, but one day, after visiting a local high school, he changed his mind. He had been invited to talk to students about technology, but one young man raised his hand and asked, "Mr. Hill, are you the guy from that airplane video?" The room went silent. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," he said. "That was me." The boy looked at him with wide eyes. "How did you stay so calm?" he asked. Marcus thought for a moment, then said softly, "Because losing control would have given them exactly what they wanted. Sometimes strength isn't loud. It's silent." The boy nodded slowly, and in that small exchange, Marcus realized that his story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been made to feel less than they were. From that day on, he started speaking, not to tell the story of pain, but the story of power and the power of calm, the power of truth, the power of witnesses. He became a quiet voice for equality in travel, working with advocacy groups to make airlines train staff better. Years later, EagleJet's name existed only in history books and documentaries. Its shiny planes had been sold, its offices closed, but Marcus's words continued to fly farther than any aircraft the company had ever built. One morning, while sitting at a coffee shop, Clara Jennings walked in, still carrying her notebook and that same determined look. "They hadn't seen each other in a long time, Clara," Marcus said with a warm smile. "Still chasing stories," she laughed, "always," then leaned forward. "But yours, it's the one people still talk about." Marcus sipped his coffee, thoughtful. "Funny thing," he said. "I didn't want it to be a story. I just wanted to sit in my seat," Clara nodded. "And because of that," she said, "millions of people got a seat they once didn't have." They sat in silence for a moment, watching planes climb into the blue sky beyond the window. The world had changed since that day. Not completely, but enough. Airlines now had stricter policies. Employees went through real bias training, and passengers knew they had the right to speak up. Marcus often said he wasn't a hero, just a man who refused to move, but in that refusal, he had given movement to thousands. His quiet act of dignity had rippled into something larger, a shift in awareness, a reminder that respect should never depend on appearance. One evening, he visited his mother's grave. The air soft and golden, he placed a small bouquet of white lilies beside her name. "You were right, Mom," he whispered. "If you keep your head high and your heart clean, the world will have to see you." He smiled faintly, wiping away a tear. They finally did as he walked away. His phone buzzed with another message, a video from a stranger. A young woman in an airport was filming herself being treated unfairly by a staff member. At the end of the clip, she said, "I remembered Marcus Hill, so I recorded this." Because no one deserves silence, Marcus closed his eyes. Exhaling deeply, the circle had completed itself. His story had become a seed planted in others, growing into courage across the world. Later that night, he stood on his balcony, watching the lights of planes blinking in the sky. They looked like tiny stars moving across the darkness, each one carrying stories of hope, fear, reunion, and love. He whispered softly, "I didn't ground them. I just made them look down before they took off," and smiled. The air was quiet, the sky calm. The world had changed, not perfectly but permanently, and Marcus Hill, the man who was pulled from first class, had finally found something far more important than a seat. He had found his purpose, his peace, and his place in history.